Hey guys, I'm here today with a good friend of mine, a great boxing writer, and just all around sports aficionado and expert. My good friend Keith Idec. How are you, buddy?
Hey, Mark, how you doing, pal?
I'm doing well. So you've been traveling quite extensively, I assume, lately?
Last week was
Yeah.
the start of the quite a run here over the next 2 months where I won't feel like I live in New Jersey at all. So,
Well, it's
but
not
uh,
necessarily a bad thing.
yeah, well, yeah, exactly. If you could eliminate the property taxes from it, I think we'd all be happier, you
Exactly.
know.
So, well, I mean, we're going to discuss the obvious from last week, but what do you have upcoming, in your travels? And what are the fights?
So next week we have a pretty good fight in the junior lightweight division. Shakur Stevenson, of course, New Jersey's own, Newark, New Jersey's own. Shakur Stevenson fighting for the WBO junior lightweight title against Jamel Herring, who was obviously got a fascinating story. A Marine who did 2 tours of duty in Iraq. Really humble, nice guy who has had a resurgence in the twilight of his career, basically, and become a world champion when it appeared in the middle of his career probably that he would not.
That looks to be a real good fight. When is that? In a week or two, you said?
Yeah, it's a week from Saturday night. It's October 23rd at State Farm Arena in Atlanta. Should be an excellent fight. They know each other very well. Probably the most intriguing element to the fight, I would say, Mark, is that Jamel Herring is trained by Terrence Crawford's trainers,
Mm,
Brian McIntyre, and the rest of Brian McIntyre's training team. They all train him together, and Shakur Stevenson is very close to that team because Terrence Crawford is his mentor. So it's a
right.
very weird position in the sense
Yeah.
that they know Shakur better than anyone. Now, Jamel Herring still has to go out there and win the fight, but I would assume it's some sort of advantage for them to have all this insight and inside knowledge into Shakur Stevenson, what works for him, what doesn't work for him. So I think it's going to be an interesting strategic matchup in that sense.
So what does Shakur have going for him? I guess age difference and just a slightly better skill level, you think?
Yeah, I'd say more than a slightly better skill level, Mark. I
Yeah.
think he's an elite level talent from an offensive standpoint. He's a great defensive fighter. He's drawn some criticism for not being the most engaging fighter in
Hmm.
terms of entertainment value, but he is one of the most talented fighters in the sport. His last fight against Jeremiah Nakatia was a snoozer, no two ways about it. He got touched
Yes.
with a right hand in the fourth round and seemed to be very cautious after that, but clearly won the fight. I mean, he won virtually every round of the fight. So, but he did take some criticism from after that fight from fans who just they want to see more from him. They want to see more entertainment. But the name of the game is winning, and
Yeah.
if you go in there and start trading with a guy and get knocked out, and your career completely changes, fans aren't going to want to hear from you either. So it's a
Yeah. It's a fine line. I mean, but he certainly is incredibly talented, and he's a local
yeah.
guy, so we have to pull for him for sure.
Mhm.
And then what do you have coming up after that, Keith?
Then there's a 2 week stretch in Vegas back to back. There's a Showtime card on October 30th. It's not the main event, but to me, it's the main event. Jerron Boots Ennis from Philadelphia, who's
Oh yeah.
maybe the most talented young fighter in the entire sport, including Shakur Stevenson. I mean,
Yeah.
he's an elite
Yes,
level
he is.
talent who's
Fun.
no one's been able to touch Jerron Ennis. Everyone
Yeah.
calls him Boots. No one's been able to touch him so far in 27, 28 professional fights. Really want to see him get in within a top welterweight. Those fighters have been reluctant to do that because at this point in his career, he's a very high risk, low reward type of fighter because you're not going to get paid the type of money like Terrence Crawford, for example,
Hmm.
is not going to be paid the kind of money that he is going to make to fight Sean Porter if he were to fight Jerron Ennis. But people would
Right.
love to see that, the young guy coming to take it from the I wouldn't say Terrence Crawford's 34, but
It's
he is
getting
undefeated.
there.
Right, but he's undefeated and arguably the best pound for pound fighter in the sport still. So those are the kinds of opponents that people want to see him fight. But to answer your original question, Mark, Jerron Ennis is going to fight Thomas Delorme on Showtime
Okay.
on October 30th, which is a good test for him. Delorme looked good in his last fight against Amantis Stanionis. Stanionis is a highly regarded welterweight on his way up, and Delorme gave him a pretty difficult fight. So he's kind of a gatekeeper at this point. But and then there's another welterweight fight, Jamal James against a Russian guy named Butayev, Razbad Butayev, who is technically undefeated. They're fighting for the WBA secondary title. It's a triple header there. But then the back end of that 12-day stretch in Vegas is Canelo Alvarez against Caleb Plant, which is a fight, of course, people are very much looking forward to.
So if we could, let's just delve into that a little bit. What's your thoughts on that fight?
At this point, I don't know that there's a super middleweight alive that could beat Canelo Alvarez.
Mm,
Caleb Plant is a very talented guy, a technically sound fighter, a lot of athleticism, high boxing IQ, but just has not fought anyone on Canelo Alvarez's level or anywhere near Canelo Alvarez's level,
right.
frankly. This is a huge step up for him, and I think he's very confident. I mean, I respect Caleb Plant's um, his confidence is through the roof. It always has been. He doesn't
Hmm.
believe for a second that Canelo Alvarez is this unbeatable monster that he is perceived to be in many circles. Caleb Plant's going to go into that fight believing wholeheartedly that he can knock off Canelo Alvarez, who is probably the consensus number one pound for pound fighter in the sport. So that's going to be I mean, people are very much looking forward to it. It's going to sell out MGM Grand Garden Arena, and it gives Canelo or Caleb Plant the opportunity to become the first fully unified champion in the history of the super middleweight division.
I mean, without saying the obvious, the lucky punch, but is there anybody out there at all you think could at least test Canelo at this point, or he's just cruising along and just untouchable at this point?
I do. I think if he fights David Benavidez at super
Mm,
middleweight, Benavidez has a great engine. He never stops coming forward. He's shown a great chin. He's significantly bigger than Canelo, which
much taller, right?
yeah. And Mark, a lot of super middleweights are, because Canelo's only 5'8", and
Hmm.
people did not expect, 5 years ago or even 3 or 4 years ago that he would be fighting at super middleweight.
Right.
He went up to light heavyweight to fight Sergey Kovalev, and Sergey Kovalev was about 6'1" and was at one point a murderous puncher in the light heavyweight division. He was toward the back end of his career when they fought, but he has fought much larger, physically imposing people, and for all intents and purposes, walked right through them. But Benavidez, I think, even though he's lost the same, he's interesting in that he's the only fighter I've ever seen to lose the same title twice without actually losing a fight. David Benavidez is undefeated. He tested positive for cocaine
Right.
and lost the WBC super middleweight title the first time. He was stripped of the title. Then he regained the title from Anthony Durrell, and then in one of his title defenses came in 3.5 pounds overweight, or almost three, something like that. It was an absurd amount of weight over the 168 limit, and lost the title again. So he can become a 3-time world champion without having actually lost a fight. So it's a crazy quirk there.
That's a little interesting. Yeah.
But I do think he would give Canelo trouble, and I don't think Jermall Charlo is capable of beating Canelo, particularly if he moves up. He would have to move up from 160 to 168 because Canelo would make him do that for the opportunity and the payday. And what choice really would Charlo have but to do it? But Charlo is also bigger than Canelo. He's about 6 foot. Not quite as big as David Benavidez, but bigger. I don't know that Charlo could beat Canelo, but I would like to see him either as much or more. Would like to see him fight Canelo as David Benavidez.
So I saw something pop across the internet this morning where Terrence Crawford is concerned about Errol Spence Jr.'s health. Do you have any insight into that? What his concerns are?
No, I just think in general, because I was around Terrence Crawford 2 days in a row last week in Las Vegas. He had an open workout at the top-ranked gym in Vegas on Friday, and then he was available to us after the official kickoff press conference for the Sean Porter fight on Saturday. I just think he means maybe, Errol Spence has gone through so much with the injury that he suffered in that horrific car accident 2 years ago now, and then suffered a torn retina. I don't think it was completely detached, but a torn retina, which is a career-threatening injury.
Sure.
They're saying that Errol Spence Jr. is going to come back within the next 6 to 8 months and be okay to fight. We'll have to see that to believe it, of course. But I think that's more what Terrence Crawford meant, that he's suffering these terrible injuries. One self-induced, of course, in the accident because he was over the legal limit in terms of alcohol consumption.
Right.
And then the other is just maybe wear and tear from sparring over the years, because that he did not have that injury when he fought Danny Garcia back in December, or if he did, it wasn't detected by the Texas Commission testing. So I think that's what he meant more than anything. So and frankly, Terrence Crawford is tired of calling out Errol Spence Jr. He's tired of talking about that fight. He said, like he said the other day, he said, there are other welterweights that I can fight that people will be interested in. Of course, the Spence fight is the one that people want to see the most. You could argue the fight that people in boxing want to see the most above any other.
Any others? Yeah.
But Errol Spence Jr. is a diminished fighter at this point, in the sense that he's been in this horrific accident and suffered all these injuries. And while he looked very good against Danny Garcia and showed no signs of being a worse fighter than he was before the accident, now he's coming off a serious eye injury. You just don't know what's left of Errol Spence Jr., even though he has never lost and he's only 31 years old.
Yeah, and 31 kind of become so you slide into 32. Now it's almost getting to be that tipping point, right, in age for that division of fighter, maybe.
I think sometimes it depends, of course, Mark, as you well know, dealing with the physical part of fighters, depends on how much wear and tear they have on their bodies and how many fights they have. Errol Spence Jr. has 27 fights. I believe he's 27-0 with 21 knockouts. So he doesn't have a ton of fights, but he was a decorated amateur. He's been fighting since he was a little kid. So those amateur fights all count in terms of the wear and tear on a fighter, and you've seen that a million times in the gym. Kids have hundreds of amateur fights and then they're just not good as professionals, maybe to some extent because
burned out already.
Burned out physically, maybe mentally. But also, guys peak when they're amateur sometimes too. But yeah, so I look at Crawford in the same way. Like, Crawford has 37 fights. He's 37-0 with 28 knockouts. He hasn't been in a ton of wars. He's been in some back and forth fights. The Kavaliauskas fight was a grueling fight. The David Benavidez fight was a tough fight from a physical standpoint because Benavidez was so much bigger than Terence Crawford. But he hasn't been in a lot of wars where you would say, oh, man, I don't know if Terence Crawford's going to be the same fighter after that. So even though he just turned 34 a couple of weeks ago, I think he still has some of his physical prime left, even though his age might not be the number that people would say would be part of his physical prime under ordinary circumstances.
Yeah, his chronological is greater than his physical and emotional state of fighting. Right. Yeah. So what with Sean Porter, I've always liked Sean. I mean, I don't know him personally. I mean, I've met him once very briefly, but he seems to be a pretty decent guy. And he just one of those guys that is always kind of hanging around and performs well. Maybe he doesn't win all the time, but he always shows up to fight. He's always in great condition. What do you think is going to happen now, with Crawford?
Well, I look at it, at least on paper, Mark, as the toughest fight of Terence Crawford's career. Sean Porter is a dog, and I mean that in the most positive sense. You're going to have to kill Sean Porter to get rid of him. He's only lost to top fighters who were undefeated at the time. His first loss came against Kell Brook when Kell Brook was considered one of the best welterweights in the world. It was for a welterweight title. It
was a great fight too.
For Porter's welterweight title at the time, the IBF championship. He lost a majority decision, and he lost a unanimous decision to Keith Thurman in what was a very, very close fight and maybe the best action fight of 2016. And then, of course, he gave Errol Spence Jr., who was considered, a significant favorite over Porter. He gave him he gave him definitively the toughest fight of his career. Now, he knocked Porter down in the 11th round. Sean Porter got up from that, came back and fought hard to make it to the final bell and won on one of the scorecards. So you could look at it like, if everyone wants to see Errol Spence fight Terence Crawford, well, people should be pretty excited. Even though Sean Porter technically has 3 losses on his record, people should be almost equally excited to see Sean Porter fight Terence Crawford because he damn near beat Errol Spence. So this is the toughest fight on paper for Terence Crawford. And you can see in the way that Terence Crawford speaks about Sean Porter that he knows what he signed up for here. He knows what type of dogfight that this is going to be.
Yeah. That's I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say they're contemporaries too. They've known each other since they were kids, came up through the American amateur system together. There was a point when they said they would not fight each other because they were so friendly. And Terence has such respect for Sean Porter, who, as you alluded to, Mark, one of the nicest people in boxing, a very smart, charismatic guy, does a great job broadcasting on Fox. He's really, he's one of the prime examples of what's right with boxing, about how boxing changes lives for the better, has a great relationship with his dad. His dad is is his head trainer, a character in his own right. And I think Sean, again, like I said, is just an example of what's right about this sport and what it can help people become in their lives. And Terrence Crawford respects him personally, professionally, and he knows the toughness that Sean Porter has within him that is going to make this a very, very difficult fight.
Yeah, I'm the utmost respect for him. I remember it's a while back now, but there was a kid that was coming up on his first fight at Gleason's, and Sean moved around with him.
Mhm.
You know, and for that kid,
Yeah.
he ended up having a couple, 3 or 4 pro fights, but still, what a you know, he didn't have to do that,
Mhm.
and he gave him some work, and it was really cool.
Yeah.
Was he supposedly such a like a top level recruit football player coming out of Ohio? Is that true? I had heard something to that effect.
There are varying stories of how good he actually was. He was a good football player, but he's a small guy. He's
Small
only
guy.
5'7".
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, where exactly you're going at 5'7" at
Right.
the top
Yeah.
level of college
But
football. I mean, there are some exceptions, but
when I stood next to him at Barclays, his neck
oh
is
no,
just like,
yeah. Well, look, I'm barely 5'7" myself, so I'm not knocking 5'7" guys. But when you're next to Sean Porter, I mean, he's
he's
put together.
huge.
I mean,
He's
he's no joke.
jacked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, and takes care. He's one of these guys that you don't have to worry about. A lot of these PBC fighters, in particular, have gotten themselves in trouble, not just with the law, but also, drinking a lot and doing,
Yeah.
kind of living the way you would expect a 20-something
With some money.
multi-millionaire
Yeah.
to live between
Yeah.
fights. But Sean is very disciplined. He doesn't live that kind of life. He doesn't go, and Terrence Crawford as well. I mean, Terrence Crawford is, he lives a clean life. I don't even think, I don't follow him around, obviously, but I
Yeah.
don't even think Terrence Crawford drinks like
I
a
would
sip
say
of.
that in the both of those guys are outliers
Yeah,
in
no,
professional sports in general. You know?
right,
Yeah.
right. And there's something to be said for it, right? Because here
Sure.
they are.
Absolutely.
Sean
Yeah.
Porter's 33, Terrence Crawford's 34, and they're still at the top level of the sport.
Yeah.
Making their guarantees are combined about $10 million for this fight. And it's not, as Terrence Crawford said the other day, in his opinion, it's not the best fight that can be made for him in the welterweight division, excluding Errol Spence. He thinks the Keith Thurman fight is bigger for. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that at this point because Keith Thurman hasn't fought for so long. But he said he thought that was a bigger fight for him. And he said, not that the Virgil Ortiz fight would be a bigger fight because Ortiz is not nearly as established as Sean Porter, but it is a fight that people would want to see because Virgil Ortiz has knocked out everyone he has fought. He's a young kid. He's in his early 20s. I mean, he's a knockout artist. He's an exciting fighter. And that's an opponent that Terrence Crawford said he is willing to fight. And I know fans would, if he beats Sean Porter, fans would be beating the drum for that fight because they're so enthused by what they've seen from Virgil Ortiz so far.
So, all right, well, we got to get to it. This past weekend, we had the big fight, Fury and Deontay Wilder, and you were there, obviously. And what's your take and what are your insights into what occurred?
Well, it was a fun fight, obviously. I mean, one guy goes down twice in the same round. He knocks down Deontay Wilder at the previous round and looks like he's going to get him out of there even earlier than he did in the previous fight, which wasn't looking good for me because I predicted that Deontay Wilder would knock out Tyson Fury within 6 rounds. And almost right there for a few minutes there in the 4th round. I mean, otherwise, not so much. But it was a fun fight. It was an entertaining, epic, back and forth type of fight. It was a little sloppy. I mean, people throw. It was a great fight in that boxing needed this type of fight, where 2 top heavyweights in a heavily hyped fight delivered more bang for your buck than you possibly could have imagined. Right? I mean, people, even if you paid $80 to watch it, you could not have come away from that being disappointed. Yeah, I mean, how often do you see a heavyweight title fight in which both guys go down? There were a total of 5 knockdowns. Fury knocked down Wilder 3 times in 3 separate rounds. Wilder almost knocked him out in the 4th round. It looked like people were complaining about the slow count, and maybe justifiably so to some extent. But you got real bang, literally and figuratively, for your buck on Saturday night. That doesn't always happen in pay-per-view fights. In fact, it's almost rare because when guys at the elite level fight each other, they're not going to be knockdown, drag out type of fights because they're so good. They're so good defensively. They're so comparably matched. The fights are not going to be Gaddy Ward. That's just not going to, Corrales Castillo. That's just not going to
Mhm.
happen generally when those types of guys get in the ring together. But it was, well, no one will confuse Deontay Wilder for a skilled fighter. Let's say that.
Yeah.
But he is the most, look, I wasn't alive to watch Jack Dempsey and people like that. I would venture to guess that he's the hardest hitting heavyweight and maybe the hardest hitting, most concussive puncher in the history of the sport.
Mm.
Tyson Fury has repeatedly said that himself. Of course, he never got punched by guys in the
George
1920s,
Foreman or
right? And George Foreman
yeah,
was a murderous puncher also.
yeah.
But even in the depleted state that Deontay Wilder was in for almost all of the fight, because inexplicably he seemed exhausted in the second round.
Right. Yeah.
But even in a depleted physical state, and at some point broke his hand yet again, he's always injured. He suffers injuries in almost every fight, some of which require surgery. But he broke his hand again his right hand again
Mhm.
at some point in the fight. So he's got a broken hand. He's dead tired. He's been down. Yet Tyson Fury was wary of Deontay Wilder right up until the end of the fight.
Yeah.
Even when it looked like he didn't even look like he could stand up.
Right. Which he's
Yeah,
got that dimension where one swing, one swipe of the paw, and it could be lights out for you. The conditioning aspect. So he went up in weight for this fight to what, 238?
Yeah, he went up 7 pounds. He was a career high
So
231 for the rematch and 238 for this fight. Yeah.
and then there's some, there's always going to be, well, he's doing PEDs and this thing. So Mark Breland came out, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, saying that Deontay Wilder's untrainable. I don't know what he meant. I didn't read the article because I didn't have time, but I do know that my past experience with some fighters, one that you knew, Manny Lucero,
Mhm.
really talented kid, but he just was one of those guys. I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a good time. He didn't really do his road work. He didn't, so he dominates somebody for 3 rounds and he just totally tank out. Do you think it's possible Wilder wasn't putting in that work, in terms of his conditioning?
No, I think he's conditioned, and I think he lifted a lot of weights and everything. Which, Mark, you obviously know way
Yeah.
more about this than me or most people. I don't know necessarily that was a great idea, to go about your training in that way when you've never done it before. But
Right.
the reason he was trying to bulk up for the fight, and he did. I mean, he looked bigger and thicker and he was bigger and thicker than he ever was. I mean,
Mhm.
not to the point where he looked like he was immobile or anything, but he only weighed 212 pounds for the first fight. So he was
Right.
26 pounds heavier for the third fight.
Not far away from being a cruiser.
Right. Exactly. No,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And yet still had this otherworldly power somehow
Right.
at 212 pounds. But I think what he was trying to do, and he really didn't implement it all that well, was he was trying to be physically stronger so that when he was in clinches with Tyson
Mm.
Fury, that he could withstand Fury's physicality and better stand up to it in the later rounds of the fight. Now, clearly it did not work because, again, I don't know how he was tired by the second round,
Mhm.
but he was. He was noticeably tired and then got knocked down in the third round, but again, has that type of power where, like he
Anything
always
could happen.
says, you got to be perfect for 12 rounds. I've only got to be perfect for 2 seconds. And
Yeah.
in 2 instances in the fourth round, he was perfect for 2 seconds and almost knocked Tyson Fury out. But the biggest mistake that I think that Wilder made in the fight was before the fight, he repeatedly said, and Malik Scott in detail explained to us how Deontay Wilder was not going to allow Tyson Fury to wear him out by putting him in headlocks and front face
Mhm.
locks and lean. You can't have a 280-pound person
Lean
leaning
on
down
you.
on you. You can't have it and expect to have your legs throughout the course of a fight that went 10 plus rounds. Almost they went into the 11th round. So there's no way, I think, if you don't avoid that from happening, there's no way that you're not going to be depleted relatively
Mhm.
early in the fight.
True.
And he was, and he allowed. I can't believe that he allowed it, or that Malik Scott allowed him to allow it. But maybe
Mhm.
if you see it start happening, pound home to him. You can't let him. Even if you have to hit. I'm not advocating cheating or
I know
fouling,
what you
or
mean.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
get this guy off of you.
Yeah.
Because he's doing it on purpose. It's a tactic, and it worked in the
Absolutely.
second fight, and it worked in the third fight, and you didn't do anything about it. So I don't know I don't know what would have had to happen to him in the second fight for him to not be hell bent on not allowing it to happen in the third fight. Yet he did allow it, and it cost him dearly on Saturday night.
So this is a really global question, and I already know the answer. It's not going to happen. But do you think at some point you have to say we need another weight division? So that if you get a guy like Wilder's like 212, 220, and he's going up against a guy that's 270, 280.
They have it now.
They do.
There's something called the WBC has it. The WBC, in its infinite wisdom, has created a new division called Bridgerweight, which is between cruiserweight and heavyweight, which would do exactly what you're suggesting. Right. The smaller heavyweights would fight the smaller heavyweights. I'm not really crazy about it.
I mean, see it.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're a heavyweight or you're not a heavy. No one's.
Right.
If you're 201 pounds and you want to fight, let's just say Vladimir Klitschko, who is 250 or whatever. That's whatever. That's your decision. I don't think
true.
The last thing that we need in boxing at this point, Mark, is more champions, more divisions. I mean, people are confused and annoyed by it enough as it is.
Right.
And there was a lot of backlash from fans and from media when they came out with this Bridgerweight division because it's just.
Probably why I haven't heard of it yet.
Either get your butt down to cruiserweight and do the work to become a cruiserweight, or be a heavyweight. If you can get down to 207, you can get down to 199 point whatever or 200 exactly, which is the limit for the cruiserweight division.
Yeah. Well, if you can't run with the big dogs, stay on the porch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're not gonna we're rewarding laziness by creating another division.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to lose another 7 pounds or whatever, 8 pounds. Come on.
Right. That's very, very true. Yeah. I think they do it in the amateurs, though. Don't they have a super heavyweight division now?
They do, yeah. And that was part of
the reason
what's behind it. Okay, well, you have a heavyweight division in amateur boxing. You have a super heavyweight division. Yeah. But again, I just don't think we need more divisions or more titles or whatever.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Or more organizations.
And as it pertains to Deontay Wilder, Mark, I would just say this. Deontay Wilder, like I told you before, was 212 pounds the first time he fought Tyson Fury. And I don't remember exactly what Tyson Fury weighed for that. He might have been 255 for that fight or whatever. But so he outweighed him by 40 plus pounds.
Right.
It didn't stop him from almost knocking Tyson Fury out. Put him down twice in the fight. So
yeah, that's very true. No, great point. Ed Berlanga, apparently he suffered a bicep injury, tear.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which is suspicious to me, I have to say.
In what sense?
Well, generally speaking, when you get a bicep tear or that's an indication of and I'm not saying it's the case here, but it could be of steroids, because what happens, anabolic steroids dry out your ligament and tendon attachments, and that's when you see the rolled bicep or the chest tears and stuff like that. Because you have a Golgi tendon, which is like your carburetor on your car. Mm-hmm. It'll allow the muscle to only generate enough power that it doesn't detach. Mm-hmm. Now, this could be from throwing a punch and having it stop, blocked or whatever. That's possible.
Yeah,
I'd have to find out what they're saying. But he's out for quite a while now, right? 6 to 8 months as well.
Yeah, so it happened, and I don't know what Edgar Berlanga is doing in training and what he's not doing. What I do know is that his defensive flaws were exposed in that fight on Saturday night, and he needs to, when he's able, because he will have surgery within the next week. He completely tore the short head of his left biceps. So he needs surgery, but they did tell him that he would only need, and I say only because it sounds much more serious than the recovery time would suggest. They said he needs 3 months of inactivity. Then he can go back to like light boxing training and go back to the gym. And they're hopeful, I don't know how realistic this is, but they're hopeful that he can fight in March in Puerto Rico, because the plan for Edgar Berlanga was to fight Saturday night. They did not anticipate it being the type of fight that it was, in which he was hit with several clean punches against a guy who's not known as a puncher, was actually knocked down in the 9th round by a counter punch. It was a flash knockdown. Wasn't really hurt. He was more annoyed by it than
a little off balance. I think you and I discussed this. He was following through on a hook, so he's already going in that direction.
Right.
And the kid came over the top of the right hand.
And he was more off balance than hurt for sure. But it was eye-opening.
Sure.
He wasn't supposed to be put down by a guy who's not known as a huge puncher. And the other punches that he took, maybe in the 5th and 6th round, where he got hit with some really clean shots, if he's fighting a puncher and you take those kind of shots, you're not going to be able to withstand that type of punishment.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
his defensive flaws were exploited a little bit. He needs to work on that when he is able to get back in the gym. He's still a big puncher, but he went the distance for the second time in his career after knocking out his first 16 opponents in the first round. Now that's not going to last forever. You start fighting real guys who are not, who are legitimate top 15 contenders. They're not going to blow over every time you touch them. But he is a big puncher, though. I think he's got real power.
No question.
But it's a serious injury. It's a setback for him. He did win the fight, I thought, conclusively. I think all three judges gave him 7 rounds, and that sounded about right to me because in the middle rounds he lost at least 2, maybe 3 rounds, I thought. So he won 96-93 on all 3 scorecards because of the knockdown in the 9th. But his star has fallen to some extent from where he was at the beginning of this calendar year. He goes the distance in April with Damon Nicholson, who's a solid fighter, but who had been knocked out. And now has this type of trouble with Marcelo Caceres, who had been knocked out by Billy Joe Saunders. He gave Billy Joe Saunders a tough fight, and Billy Joe Saunders is a slickster and a very talented fighter, but not a puncher. And when Billy Joe Saunders realized that he was in jeopardy of maybe losing that fight because he was behind on one scorecard going into the 11th round and perhaps in danger of blowing the Canelo Alvarez payday, Billy Joe Saunders turned it up a couple of notches and got him out of there in the 11th round. So it's a little disconcerting that Billy Joe Saunders, when he put his mind to it and is not a puncher, got Caceres out of there and Berlanga could not. That's a questionable takeaway from the fight as well.
So I see that Marcus Brown's got a fight coming up with I have trouble saying this guy's name.
Well, people pronounce it 4 different ways, I think. Better Biev, Turbiev. You hear all different things. The bottom line is this guy knocks people the F out. You talk about Wilder being a concussive puncher. He's the Wilder, so to speak, of the light heavyweight division. He's 50. He doesn't have a lot of fights, even though he's 36 years old, because he's had some promotional issues and he turned pro late and everything. But he's 15-0 with 15 knockouts. The one thing I would say to Marcus Brown going into this fight is, as Liam Neeson once said on the phone in that movie Taken, good luck.
Yeah. I mean, Marcus is a pretty good fighter, but this is a whole nother level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a talented kid, Marcus Brown, but, sort of odd that now it turns out that John Pascal was busted for PEDs. I don't know what he was doing before the Marcus Brown fight. It doesn't mean necessarily that he was on PEDs for the fight because he got caught in an ensuing fight. Right. But he did get popped for PEDs later. But he was beating up Marcus Brown in that fight and wound up winning a technical decision, which was pretty surprising. So if an aged John Pascal could beat Marcus Brown, I don't like his chances going up to Montreal and fighting a guy who, when he hits you on the chin, it's night.
Yeah, it's game over. Who besides Boots, who's kind of flying under the radar that you think is going to be really exciting and a dynamic fighter?
I don't know if Virgil Ortiz is flying under the radar because he too has knocked everyone out, but he's the other guy. Everyone is building to what this means. Probably, Mark. People want to see Boots. Boots is 24, I believe, and Virgil Ortiz, I think, is 22. So they're in the same age range and they're elite welterweights. Different type of fighters, but the 2 guys that people want to see eventually in a super fight in the welterweight division, which, as you know as well as I do, Mark, that means it's probably never going to happen.
Right.
Yeah. But those are the 2 guys. I mean, the 2 up and coming young guys that people are really looking at as stars, and Boots even more so because in Virgil Ortiz's last fight against Mean Machine, he did get buzzed. He got rocked pretty good. He got hurt on more than one occasion. And Kavalauskas is a hard puncher. He should have been credited with a knockdown in the 3rd round of his fight against Terrence Crawford. So he's a puncher. I mean, he's not a top 5 welterweight, but he's probably back end of the top 10 welterweights. And he gave Ortiz some trouble. But those 2 guys in the welterweight division are the guys that people are really excited about. Tank Davis is 26 now, going on 27. I wouldn't say he's still obviously in the heart of his prime. I don't know if you consider him young anymore necessarily, but he, of course, has knocked out all but one of his opponents in his career and is becoming, he's a pay-per-view attraction. I think he needs a dance partner. He needs to fight a Ryan Garcia. He needs to fight Teofimo Lopez, Devin Haney. He needs to fight one of his contemporaries to kind of make the kind of magic on pay-per-view that they're hoping to make with him. But he is a pay-per-view fighter now, and he's fun to watch because he knocks people out. You know, he's 20. I think he's 25-0 with 24 knockouts now. And people love watching him. He's fighting Rolando Romero on December 5th in Los Angeles in a pay-per-view fight. It's kind of like an internet rivalry. They don't like each other. They almost got into a fight at ringside at the last Errol Spence fight against Danny Garcia. They're both promoted by Floyd Mayweather's company, so it was an easy fight to make when Tank was not getting the type of fights that they wanted him to get. All the fighters that I just mentioned.
Yeah, why are they? What's not making a connection? They're just
money. Yeah, it's all money. I mean, look, Tank would be a favorite against, in my opinion, he would be a favorite against Ryan Garcia. I think he would knock Ryan Garcia out. He'd be a favorite against Devin Haney. Devin Haney's a very skillful fighter, but showed some vulnerability in his fight against Jorge Linares, who hurt him in the 10th round. Yeah. So I would favor Tank to win that fight. The one lightweight fight that I might not favor him in and we would want to see is Teofimo Lopez. And I think people would be very excited to see Teofimo Lopez against Gervonta Davis, right?
Yeah.
Again, we're not going to see it because Teofimo Lopez is going to, I would assume, beat up George Kambosos when they eventually do fight here next month or the month after with this all this craziness with Triller. So they're going to fight on a DAZN card, and I would fully expect Teofimo Lopez to win that fight. And then he's probably going to move up to 140. Now, Tank has fought at 140, but against not a bigger fighter for sure and an undefeated fighter in Mario Barrios, but certainly not the type of fighter that Teofimo Lopez is.
No, yeah. Where does Lomo fit into all this?
Well, he's fighting December 11th at Madison Square Garden. He's going to fight Richard Comey. Yeah. I mean, look, Comey's again, a back end of the top 10 lightweights, probably. I mean, a tough guy, a former world champion.
Yes.
But he was demolished by Teofimo Lopez on that same show, the night of the Heisman Trophy presentation. You know, they show the Heisman Trophy presentation and they roll right into the boxing as with its strong lead in and everything. Well, in 2019, Richard Comey fought Teofimo Lopez in the co-feature of that event and got demolished. He's fought once since then, and while he looked good against Jackson Mariñez, I don't know. I don't want to see him fight Vasily Lomachenko. Now, the problem is Lomachenko's handlers at Top Rank, they tried to get him one of the younger lightweights, namely Devin Haney. I mean, they wanted to make that fight because it's a fight that Devin Haney has said that Vasily Lomachenko avoided, which is nonsense because he wound up fighting Teofimo Lopez. My opinion, Teofimo Lopez is better than Devin Haney, so it'd be hard to say he was running from Devin Haney when he ran toward Teofimo Lopez, who beat him. Nevertheless, they had the financial aspect of it made that fight impossible to make for December 11th. So he's fighting a second tier lightweight who's kind of a recycled guy at this point, and I don't think many people are going to be all that. People want to see Lomachenko fight whenever he fights because he's such a uniquely skilled fighter. Yeah, of course. He does things that most fighters or almost all fighters cannot do. So people do like watching him. But, he looked great against Nakatani, who actually gave Teofimo Lopez some problems, and and Lomachenko just beat the crap out of him. So, excuse me, he looks good. I mean, even at 35 years old, he looks like he's still got a lot left. But I don't think we're going to see a Lomachenko Lopez rematch as much as people want to see it, because Teofimo Lopez is just not going to give him the satisfaction. That they made a business mistake, in my opinion. And I think it's kind of irrefutable at this point by not demanding a rematch clause in the contract for the Lopez fight, because Lopez didn't have any leverage. I mean, if he wanted the fight, and they demanded a rematch clause, he would have had to do that was the fight he was chasing. So he had no, leverage to say, I'm not giving him a rematch clause. He was the underdog. He was the B side. But now that he's the A side and he has complete control of the situation, he has repeatedly said, I am not giving Lomachenko a rematch. I don't care who wants to see it. I don't care how bad he begs. It's not happening.
So what is that telling us? Afraid of him?
No, he's certainly not afraid of him. He just beat him.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, and he wanted I think it's more of an ego thing. And I have to be honest, Lomachenko, for as talented as he is, he's a very arrogant guy, and he
Oh
comes
yeah.
across that way not only to other fighters but to the media. He's an arrogant guy, and his management team has a tinge of arrogance about them as well. Because
Mhm.
I asked Egis Klimas who was his manager before they
Yes.
fought last year during fight week, is there a rematch clause in this contract?
For
And he
what?
kind of scoffed at
Yeah.
my question. Well,
Yeah.
was it a dumb question now
Not so much.
when you're begging for a rematch and you can't
Yeah.
get it? So
Yeah. Well, I'll point with that. And again, one of my other favorite fighters, like another honest guy, I think, just comes and always smiling, Mikey Garcia.
mhm. Yeah,
You,
Mikey's fighting this Saturday night against Sandor Martin, a Spanish fighter who's a huge underdog and relatively unknown. I don't really see the point of the fight other than just to get Mikey back in the ring, because he hasn't
Mhm.
fought in 19 months, I think it is, since he
Wow.
fought Jesse Vargas, which is mostly pandemic related. And then he was
Yeah.
trying to get the Pacquiao fight, and Pacquiao wound up trying to fight Spence anyway. So Mikey will fight Saturday night on DAZN. I wouldn't expect that fight to last more than 6 or 7 rounds.
What's he
But
fighting at? What, 40 or 35?
140, yeah,
40.
140, yep.
Yeah.
And then he wants to fight. He says, Regis Prograis got
Yeah.
top guys at 40, Josh Taylor, people you would want to see him fight.
Yeah.
So let's hope he goes to that type of fight next.
How old is Mikey now? About 32, maybe somewhere around.
Geez, what is Mikey now? No, I think Mikey's like 34, maybe.
Is he? Yeah.
Yeah, because remember he had that 2.5 year gap
Oh
where he
yeah.
was in that contract dispute with Top Rank where he did not fight, and it's been about 5 years since he came back from that. But he literally did not have a fight for 2.5 years. So he
Mm.
lost, 2 or 3 of the prime years of his
Prime years.
career
Yeah.
on principle. And it turned out to work out for him financially, because he went on to have, he made a lot of money. I mean, DAZN was overpaying not just Mikey Garcia, but other fighters. He made $7 million was his
Wow.
total package to fight Jesse Vargas.
Oof.
Now, that market doesn't exist anymore. You're not going to make $7
No.
million to fight Jesse Vargas, but he capitalized on his position in the sport at the time, and he made a lot of money to fight Errol Spence Jr. And
Mhm.
he was well paid by Top Rank, but felt he was worth more, and then went on to prove that he was worth a lot more in fights against Adrian Broner, Spence, and a lot of other guys.
Yeah, I like Mikey. Like I said, he's an honest guy. He's, I like his game too. I like the way he fights.
Yeah. Very smart fighter, technically sound, tough kid. The interesting thing about him, Mark, is when he was growing up, like no one thought that he was going to be this type of fighter. His brother, Robert Garcia, is a former
World
IBF
champion.
130-pound
Yeah.
champion, not a star fighter by any stretch,
No.
but made it to the top level. I mean, he was in a 4-belt era, he was a world champion. And nobody thought that Mikey was going to be this good. I mean, even within his own family, he has spoken many times about no one foresaw this for him. I mean, this
Didn't he
to
also
be
say he didn't really want to box when he was
he didn't
younger?
like it. No,
Yeah.
like he didn't. Yeah, I mean, it was a family business. His father was Fernando
Yeah.
Vargas's trainer. They had a lot of good young guys come through Oxnard and everything that they trained. But Mikey Garcia had all intentions of being a fireman. He
Yeah.
took the fireman's test. Like he
Is
didn't
that
think
right?
that he was. Yeah,
Yeah.
he thought, and there's nothing wrong with being a fireman. It's a great,
No, not at
it's a
all.
dangerous job, obviously. But
Yeah.
you work a couple of days a week, you get a great pension out of it and everything. So he
Mhm.
looked at it as like that was going to be his avenue to get what he wanted out of life. He did not think, if you would have told Mikey Garcia when he was 15 years old or 16 years old that he would make $7 million for fighting anyone, let alone Jesse Vargas,
Yeah.
he would have laughed in your face probably. But
Yeah.
it's a pretty amazing story what he's been able to turn his career into.
So we'll wrap it up with Nonito Donaire. I watched his last fight. He just waxed that kid.
Mhm.
Do you think he still has any currency left?
He does. Unfortunately, he was supposed to fight John Riel Casamero in August, which would have been an all Filipino fight, would have been an
Yeah.
all action fight that people were looking forward to. Donaire actually agreed to the fight. It was supposed to be August 14th, and it would have been a relatively quick turnaround from his demolition of Nordine Boali, who was the French fighter,
Right.
undefeated French fighter that he
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
tore right through.
Man.
So he's
Like
still got
butter.
something left at 38 years old, which again, if you would have told me in 2013 when he lost to Guillermo Rigondeaux
Rigondeaux, yeah.
that he would still be a top level fighter in 2021, I think we all would have gotten a good chuckle out of that, right?
Yeah, but he's really athletic. He's a really talented guy, and he's got a pretty good mindset, I think.
He does, and he's obviously very resilient because he suffered a few losses and everything, and it looked like his career was going to be over. And then
Right.
in kind of an unprecedented move. He was fighting at featherweight at 126, and he's in his mid 30s, and then goes back down to 118, which is the
That's
weight where he
crazy.
felt he was best.
Yeah,
And that
that's
turned out to
crazy.
be true, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because he gave Inoue, the monster, he gave him a pretty
Yes,
tough
he
fight.
did.
I would say that Inoue won that fight conclusively, I think, but Donaire did buzz him in the fight for sure,
Yes.
and gave
Yeah.
him a tougher fight maybe than people were expecting. That might be a rematch for him at some point in the foreseeable future because he has one of the bantamweight titles now. But what happened with the John Riel Casimero fight, and Casimero's the WBO champion, who people are high on now too, and he's a big puncher. He didn't. Him and his wife Rachel Donaire, who is his manager, did not move forward with the fight because Casimero was not enrolled in the WBC's clean boxing program within a time frame that they thought was necessary.
Yeah.
I don't know. Look, I don't know what's going on with any of these guys. Who knows what some of these guys are doing? There's a lot of money at stake, and there are guys, frankly, in all sports that are going to cheat. I'm not saying John Riel Casimero is a cheater. You know this way better than me, Mark. But I'm not saying he's a cheater, but I am saying that if Nonito Donaire really wanted to fight John Riel Casimero, they could have very easily said, okay, well, he's enrolled in the clean boxing program now with VADA, so just reschedule the fight and I'll fight him later. It just seemed to me like maybe it was a bit of buyer's remorse. Like he felt, I'm riding high right now. Yes, I'm going to be paid a lot of money to fight John Riel Casimero, but there's a lot more money in a rematch with Inoue down the road.
Yeah.
I can get a fight or two in between, capitalize on this resurgence in my career, and then go fight Inoue, take one more bite at the proverbial apple, and get paid an enormous amount of money for fighting him in Japan. My opinion is that's more what happened there. I'm not saying they're not concerned about Casimero not being enrolled in a timely fashion in the clean boxing program. I think it just might have been more of a business decision than anything else.
Yeah, makes more dollars and makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's been Jorge Linares is he eclipsing, or do you think he has maybe one more kind of like with another named fight left in him?
Well, while he lost to Devin Haney, he won that night because he hurt Devin Haney in the 10th round, and he made Haney hold on, and he showed some vulnerability in Haney that people hadn't seen. So I think he'll get another payday strictly off of that. It was a reasonably competitive fight, but at the end of the 10th round, when he wobbled Haney and definitely affected him more than he had ever been affected by a punch in his career, I think that bought Linares, who I believe is 35 or 36 at this point, because he started, he was a top level fighter when he was very young. So it seems like he would probably be older than he actually is. But I think he'll get another payday or two out of it. He'll be the gatekeeper at lightweight, and he's still talented enough where he can make good action fights. But if he fights top lightweights who can punch, younger, stronger guys who can punch, he's probably going to get knocked out.
A little bit vulnerable there. Yeah. And he's an interesting, that's a really cool story too. What's he, Argentinian, right?
Argentinian, but has lived mostly in Japan. Yeah. He moved to London at some point. He's kind of been all over the world.
Yeah.
He lived in London for a while. But yeah, how many Argentinian guys? No, he's not. He's Venezuelan, not Argentinian.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Venezuela.
Yeah, Venezuela. And he left Venezuela at a very young age. And he, lived in Japan for a very long time. I don't know how many Venezuelan people live in Japan, but it's a unique story in boxing, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, the other, I don't know the fighter's name, but the Japanese kid who came, I think he was 16, to start training in Mexico because he wanted to learn and fight like
Mexican
a Mexican
style. Right.
Yeah, I forget his name, but it was.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank on it too. But
yeah, it's like a little bit of an inverse thing.
The story sounds familiar though. Yeah, no, to learn the Mexican style that everyone talks about.
Yeah. Well, it's been great, Keith. I really appreciate your time. Let's catch up again in a few weeks when you come back. We'll talk about those fights, the Porter and Crawford fight, of course, and Canelo's fight. And I'm really looking forward to that one to see. Seems to be a little bit of more bad blood than just a show between players.
Yeah. There's that. It's definitely a grudge match.
It's funny because I as you know, I'm very involved now with the Filipino martial arts. It's fun, but we were talking about some similarities between what boxing moves and stuff. And I said, if you want to learn how to throw the perfect check hook, watch the weigh-in between Canelo and as soon as Plant's right hand started to move, Canelo just stepped off and threw that hook and cut him up pretty good there. Good thing it was under the eye, right, not above it.
Yeah, and still almost caused the postponement of the fight. I mean,
Sure.
it's very rare that they actually punch each other. I mean, there's pushing and shoving
Right.
and theatrics involved in these press conferences and stuff, but very rarely do you see guys exchange real punches. Now,
Right.
Caleb Plant's left was more like of an open hand slap that he missed,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because Canelo was on a podcast the other day with Showtime's Brian Custer, and he said
Mhm.
that the way that he pushed Plant with two hands and pushed him back several feet on the stage. And he said by the way Plant looked as he was purposefully coming toward him, he knew that he was going to try to punch him. So he
Right.
knew that something was coming, which is, I mean, he ducked that left hand pretty much. I think he might
Yeah.
have grazed him a little bit with that open hand left, and then kind of two-pieced him inside real quick. And it was maybe a microcosm of what's to come on November
What's gonna
6th. It was telling, but thankfully Caleb Plant did not have a cut under his eye. I mean, we saw him the other day at the gym in Vegas. They had an open workout for him during the Wilder Fury fight week, and that scrape's still there. I mean, he's been able to spar and everything, but that was 3 weeks ago, and that scrape is still, it's still visible.
Are they training at Johnny Taco's? Where do they go in Vegas to get the
No, there's a gym now called City Boxing Gym. I don't know how long it's been there exactly, but it's a relatively newer, last years or whatever.
Yeah.
But he trains there. Caleb Plant trains there. Teofimo Lopez trains there. Several of the guys who live in Vegas who are, high level fighters now train at that gym.
There. Yeah, a few years ago I was in Vegas. I trained at Johnny Taco's, which is a lot of history in there.
Yeah,
pretty cool place.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, buddy. Listen, you have a great trip. Let's catch up when you get back, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure, Mark. It's good to talk to you.
Man, it was awesome having you, man. Great job. I appreciate it, Keith.
No problem. Anytime, Mark. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.